I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week, I'm passing the mic over to a couple of our editors here for a spoiler-filled conversation about the book Demon Copperhead. It's a book that our readers have been really excited about for, about a year and a half, so we figured now is the right time to actually talk about it. This is only our second book club episode, and we're still figuring out what works and what doesn't. So if you have any thoughts about these episodes or really anything you hear on the Book Review Podcast, please send them our way at books@nytimes.com. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, and welcome to another book club episode of the Book Review Podcast. I'm MJ Franklin. I'm an editor here at the New York Times Book Review, and this week we are chatting about Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. At the end of last year, we chatted about the Heaven and Earth grocery store, and that was a lot of fun, so go check that out. In general, we want to do more of these, and we thought Demon Copperhead would be a great selection this time around for a book club because all of you are so passionate about it. One of the recurring comments we got when we put out our 10 best books of 2023 list and our 100 notable books of 2023 list was, where is Demon Copperhead? To which we say it wasn't eligible, unfortunately, because it came out in 2022. However, it was on our 2022 best of lists. So we did give it all of the praise. We loved it just as much as you did. But we heard you loud and clear. There's still so much hunger and enthusiasm and passion for this book. And so that inspired us to talk about it as a book club. Joining me in discussing this book are two of my favorite people to talk about books with. First up, your friend, your fave, Liz Egan. Hi, Liz.
Hi, MJ. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming back. Liz is a fellow editor here at the Book Review. She was here for our Heaven and Earth grocery store podcast. I also want to give Liz a shout out. You, a few weeks ago, wrote a great piece about Maurice Sendak and his house and which is now like a museum of his work and process. And it was a great story.
Thank you. Maybe after hearing this, Barbara Kingsolver will invite me to her house. You never know.
Also with us is Anna Dubenko. Anna is our newsroom audience director. Hi, Anna.
Hi, MJ.
I have a question for you. What does it mean that you're our newsroom audience director?
Oh my gosh. We don't have enough time on this podcast for me to answer that question. It means I oversee social media for the Times, search, community, all of you who love to comment on our books coverage. My team is the one looking after that the comments are civil and thoughtful.
Perfect. And then also, you're just one of my favorite people to talk about books with. I feel like our DMs on Instagram are just me being like, you're reading this? What do you think? And then you do the same to me?
Yes.
And then also, in addition to all that you do here at the Times, before you came to the Times, you were in a PhD literature program.
I famously dropped out of a PhD literature program, but that is true.
Yeah, you can read about it at the Times because you wrote about it a few years ago for our Star section.
That's right. I think the headline was Why I Quit Yale. And maybe the subhead was like, if James Franco could do it, why couldn't I?
Because he was in your program.
He was.
Yeah. So this is all to say we have assembled an expert panel to talk about this book. I like to say, before we dig in and have the meal, you got to set the table. So I just want to do a quick plot synopsis of what Demon Copperhead is about. Demon Copperhead is Barbara Kingsolver's 17th book. It is a retelling of Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, reframed here to explore Appalachia and the opioid crisis. We follow the life and struggles of Damon Fields, nicknamed Demon because of his energy and Copperhead because of his bright red hair. We open with his birth. The opening line is, "First, I got myself born." He is born to a mother struggling with substance abuse. His father has died before he was born, and so he's kind of in dire, tough straits. First, we follow Demon in the struggles of his home life. Then, when his mother overdoses and dies, Demon is sent into the foster care system, having to deal with abusive families and a series of increasingly unstable living situations. Eventually, in middle school and high school, he becomes a football star, only to suffer an injury, be prescribed opioids, and then gets pulled into the throes of his own addiction. Along the way, we see Demon grow up amid these conditions. We meet a whole cast of characters. We explore Appalachia and discuss social injustice. Anna, Liz, did I miss anything?
Nothing. I mean, you missed about 600 pages, but otherwise, I think that was an excellent synopsis.
Yeah, so much happens here. I guess I should also say this takes place in the west part of Virginia, not West Virginia, but like the farthest west you could go in Virginia, in Lees County, Virginia. And so that setting is very important to the project of this book, to what Demon experiences, etc. So with that out of the way, I wanted to go around and just get general thoughts. I want to do a temperature check. How, big picture, did you feel about this book? I'm going to go to you first, Liz.
I am very enthusiastic about books that I really love. I guess that's not an uncommon trait, but this book, I read it in 3 days. I did not put it down. I could not stop thinking about it. I read a pre-publication galley. So when I read it, I didn't have anyone to discuss it with. And that almost killed me. And since the book came out, I've recommended this book to more people than I think I've ever recommended a book to. And I've heard back from more of the people who I recommended it to than I ever have with any other book in the past.
Can I ask, what is it about this book? Like what made you connect with it? I remember your enthusiasm when this came out.
Once I overcame my troubles with reading in, I guess I would say, dialect, I think what drew me in was just how much I loved Demon and I wanted to see what happened to him. I'm not a particular Dickens fan. I actually went back and read David Copperfield after reading Demon Copperhead, so I did it in the reverse order. I can't really put my finger on exactly what it was that made it such a propulsive read, a word we try to avoid at the book review, but there I said it. I just connected with it and absolutely loved it.
Having someone pick up and read and respond to your recommendation is the best feeling that as a books professional we can have. Anna, can you tell us about your general top-level thoughts about this book? Well,
I liked this book, and I, too, am enthusiastic about books that I love. I'm not a professional book recommender, but I do it amateurly on the side. And you're right, there's nothing better than when you have just a passion for a book, getting others to read it. I have not recommended this book, though I can respect what it is and what it did, and I enjoyed reading it. I just reread it recently, and it was a great book, but I felt like I could put it down.
Interesting. Well, before I dig into that, I have a quick question, which is you mentioned that you read it, last year, and then you reread it again now. Did anything change in your understanding of the book, your approach of the book between readings?
Yes. What I had forgotten about this book, which, it's Dickensian, and so it's supposed to be modeled off of this serialized sort of cliffhanger structure. But I had totally forgotten how each chapter really was contained in of itself. Everything that happens in one chapter really has like a beginning, middle, and end. And so when I was thinking about different scenes that really stuck out, I sort of had imagined them to run across multiple chapters. Rereading that, I was reminded that it really followed that Dickensian structure.
That's really interesting because as I was reading, I also felt that kind of compartmentalized quality of this book. I actually felt it was 3 separate books rather than just one. The first section with Demon in foster care is younger. It feels like the scrappy Dickensian orphan story. And you're kind of caught in the throes of this. First, you're meeting this person and his voice, which is so kind of electric and magnetic. And he's kind of just doing kid stuff. He's harvesting tobacco and getting poisoned that way.
Kid stuff.
I remember doing that. No, I'm just kidding. No, he's just doing all of this kid stuff of trying to get his feet under him. He's drawing all the time. He's drawing these superheroes. And you're kind of just swept along that way. Kind of felt like this classic coming of age story to me. The second section is when he finally is with Coach. He has found a more stable, permanent home. And then he is becoming this football star. And that momentum, what's he going to be? Where's he going to end up? That momentum is kind of gone. And instead we're in this roving portrait of Appalachia. And that's where we meet a huge cast of characters, even more than we've already met. But we kind of get the sense of the community that Demon is going to be encountering. We get cookouts. We get homecoming games. the focus in that section wasn't Demon, it was the environment. And then the third section is what happens when Demon is addicted to opioids. And that section, for me, was the hardest to read. It is a Greek tragedy level of suffering. The body count in the last 200 pages alone is just like tragedy after tragedy. So that, for me, is that other tone, that other kind of like force to the novel. So yeah, that compartmentalized quality, I definitely felt that.
Yeah, and I like the way that you think of it in 3 parts. And maybe I think the first part was so electric, and to use your banned word, propulsive. And then I think towards the end, especially when it gets so grim and tragic, is when I found myself putting the book down more than I would expect to.
It's hard to read. It's hard to read.
MJ, tell us how you felt about the book.
I think I come down in between the two of you. When I first heard the premise of this book using Dickens to tell the story of the opioid crisis, I was like, this sounds really cool and really ambitious, and I'm excited to see how it pulls this off. But I was also like a little bit fearful, and I had a little bit of trepidation because it could be dutiful. It has this responsibility to Dickens, and it has this responsibility to covering this serious topic. And I felt like it was saddled with so much other than just tell a good story. And I'm happy to say I did not, in the end, feel like this was a dutiful book. It feels lively. It feels propulsive, to use that banned word 3 times in a short amount of time. It feels searching. It feels pointed. There is a very strong political message here, but I feel like it's worked in, for the most part, pretty seamlessly. There were lines where I was like, this doesn't feel like Demon. This doesn't feel like any of the characters. This feels like the authorial hand coming in and like making big statements, which is totally fine, but sometimes that takes me out of the stories. For the most part, though, I felt like the political commentary did not feel mapped on top of the book, but it felt seamlessly worked in. So I really loved that. I did have some bumps along the way. Maybe we'll talk about them. There were very specific nitpicky things that I think had repercussions for how I approached this book. But overall, the thing that stuck with me is just like how much I felt for these characters. My notes are just like, oh, sweet Tommy, poor Maggot, oh, Demon, no. And that's how I felt. And I felt that all the way through. And yeah, I loved it. So I had a quick question. We kind of mentioned it before, but had either of you read much Dickens or much Barbara Kingsolver before going into this book? I'm going to throw it over to you first, Liz.
I have read a lot of Barbara Kingsolver. I might be a Barbara Kingsolver completist. I'm not positive. And I have read her books over a very long span of time. So please don't ask me about The Bean Trees, which came out, I think, when I was in high school a million years ago. As for Dickens, I read what I was required to read in school. And I was never someone to pick up Great Expectations just for fun. I have a healthy respect and a deep enthusiasm, but not I wouldn't consider myself an expert by any stretch.
I had only read Great Expectations by Dickens before looking into David Copperfield, and I love that book. It took me a long time. I read it in like 9th grade, and I don't know, it's just one of those books that connected with me. I think Mrs. Havisham is what I call our long grudge queen. She really said, I'm angry and I'm not going to forget. What about you, Anna? Have you read much Dickens or Barbara Kingsolver?
So I have read Great Expectations many times beyond what was required in school. And weirdly, I think that's the only Dickens I've ever read somehow. That can't be true. I certainly have never read to this day David Copperfield. But so much of this, especially at the beginning, maybe because I've read Great Expectations so many times, feels like I know where this is coming from, and especially this coming of age tale just maps quite nicely onto Great Expectations too.
Liz, you said you are a completionist, or don't fact check, but you are a completionist of Barbara Kingsolver. How does this stack up in her lineup to you?
I think it's the best one. My last favorite was the Poisonwood Bible. But this one is just next level. And you feel her, well, I feel her effort in it. And normally that seems like a negative thing, when you can feel the author trying really hard, that takes you out of the moment. But in this case, I felt she knew these places. She knew Dickens. I felt she had done her homework on the opioid crisis. And I loved that she put it in the hands of a child. And then we got to watch him grow up.
I have only read the Poisonwood Bible other than this one. And that one I think is also astonishing. I loved that book. And I completely agree. You can feel her trying, but it doesn't feel undue or unseemly or overworked. It just feels like this moral clarity and force. And I think that is something a lot of readers are responding to. And we are back. This is the Book Review Podcast. I'm MJ Franklin. I'm joined by Liz Egan and Anna Dubenko, and we are discussing Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I want to dive in and explore more of this book. One of the big elements of this book is the voice. Demon's voice, again, which is so particular, so lively. It's really tapping into this culture in this space of Appalachia. I'm curious to know how that voice worked for you, how you responded to it, how it resonated with you.
It is undoubtedly true that this is a voice that feels very fully conceived. He sounds like a kid when he's a kid. He sounds like a teenager when he's a teenager. The turns of phrase and even just the approach to the world is so clearly, you feel it in his voice. I have this quote that I just can't get out of my head where I think it's his first time visiting Emmy and June in the city. And they're talking. They finally he has an understanding with Emmy, and they're sort of lying in bed feeling sad. And the quote is, "We were sad together for a while. I'll never forget how that felt like not being hungry." And just that sense of, first of all, I've certainly never really thought about what it feels like to not be hungry, which is not the same as full. And just that the sadness, and yet you can hear a kid say that, and yet it is so poignant.
Yeah, that's the thing that I really loved about this book. And Liz, you mentioned how special it is that this book is told through the perspective of a kid. There's a way that like a kid's voice just kind of cuts through everything. It cuts through a lot of the politics. It cuts through a lot of just like the murkiness of adulthood. And you're just like, simply, this is how it felt. I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm going to tell you how it is. What about you, Liz? How did you feel about this voice of Demon?
I couldn't get him out of my head even after I finished the book. I missed him. And that's another thing people say all the time when they love a book. But I felt a presence in my heart. I felt he stuck with me. It's funny, MJ, you mentioned that you felt there were times when the authorial hand came down on you. And there was one part when I knew that we were having this conversation that I remembered very clearly. And it kind of irked me at the time, but it really, it stuck with me. The scene where Demon has his very first pill. He's staying in this kind of work camp. He's entered foster care. And there's just this one line that I went back to where he doesn't even know what he's taking, but he takes this pill. He describes how he feels. And he says, "We had the moon in the window to smile on us for a minute and tell us the world was ours, because all the adults had gone off somewhere and left everything in our hands." And I can't decide whether I love the simplicity of that and the wisdom of it, or whether I think it's a little bit heavy-handed. Would a kid who's just landed in foster care really feel that way? And I think I came down on the side of, I don't know, with the side of yes. But he just says the thing that you are thinking and says it plainly in his own language and with his own grammatical errors and malapropisms, if that's the right word. And I think that's what I loved the most about him.
to be a defender of that passage, it's actually vocalized through an older demon, right? Who is remembering and who is trying to tell this story in order to, well, we can discuss why he's trying to tell the story. And so perhaps at the time, young demon who in his first foster care sort of experience couldn't verbalize that, but an older reflective demon who has gone through rehab and therapy and has had time to contemplate is able to verbalize it.
This book is quietly doing some weird things with time. You are kind of fully immersed into Demon as a child, Demon growing up, but you have the context that like this is someone looking back telling his life story. And so I feel like Barbara Kingsolver had this tricky thing that she was doing, which is like putting you in the mind, the voice of a child, but you can't forget that it's an adult, because if it's too childish, it will sound like, what adult is this? But if it's too adult, it's going to be like, what child is this? And it's like a really fine line to walk. And I think for the most part, I think she like walks it phenomenally, except for some of those instances. There was an instance for me that kind of stuck out, which was she's talking. This is one of the places where I had a big gripe with the book. It's when he's learning about the word hillbilly and why it's bad for other people to say, but he can say it, etc. And in this passage, first, the person that talks to him compares it to the N-word. And I'm like, no, absolutely not. It's just not the same. It's just not. And I could understand that someone would say this to him. This is the conversation would be had. That felt authentic and genuine to the character. So that didn't stop me. But then they go on and start talking about like other words that like people say derogatorily, and deplorables is one of them. And it was just one of those like freeze frame. I bet you're wondering how we got here. I'm like, how did we end up here? And that did not feel like the character at all anymore. It felt so timely to right now that it felt so mapped onto it. I don't know. That was one thing for me. But overall, like I thought the voice was such an achievement. So the voice was the other thing that I think is both an achievement of the book, but then also starting the book was one of the hardest things for me. Because the first thing that you're getting when you open this book is Demon talking about his mom and how he was born. And so you're meeting this person in this terrible situation, and you're first hearing the voice. And the voice is applied to telling this kind of off story. I felt that the mom in this book did not have the same grace extended to some of the other characters extended to her. When other characters are in bad situations, you get a gracious, big backstory. The novel is generous to them. Mariah Peggott is an example. She's in prison, and then you get this beautiful chapter of here's the horrible situation that she was in, and she did what she needed to do to get through it. At some point, the Macabres are like, they're horrible people. They're horrible people. They like abuse. For the Macabres, that's also an example. They are horribly abusive to Demon, and yet there are moments where Demon's like, Mrs. Macabre wasn't a terrible person. This is what she was dealing with. This is everything that was going on. I didn't feel like the mom had the same grace extended to her. And so then for me, I was like, this voice, does it feel leering? And it just took me a little bit to like come around to it. Not the authenticity of the voice, but how it was deployed. And then you keep reading on, and then it just totally clicked. But that was something that I was keeping an eye out for.
I felt the exact opposite. I felt that there was grace extended to Demon's mom. And even though we didn't know her complete backstory, we knew from the beginning who Demon was. And I felt that she was responsible in large part for who he was, in conjunction with the Peggotts and with other people who cared about him. But the fact that he was such a solid little guy, even at the start, to me pointed to her innate something. I can't quite put my finger. I don't know if goodness is the right word. But the Macabres, I didn't understand why I felt the expectation that I should have some pity for them. but I felt zero pity for them. And in fact, that moment when he's lying on the floor of the dog room, that's the laundry room with the rotting floor. And I want to remind you, I read this book a year and a half ago. I'm talking about this without having checked this section, but I remember it so clearly. That moment when he's lying on the floor and he's hungry and he knows they have him there to make money off of him. And he sees the baby monitor on the shelf and he realizes not only are they starving him and making money off him and making him this workhorse for them, they're filming him and watching him. I have goosebumps as I'm saying this. I feel no pity for them.
I thought the Macabres were cartoonishly evil. And there are to me, maybe this is why I felt the way I did about this book. Stoner. Cartoonishly evil. I mean, I believe there are people like this in this world, but cartoonishly evil. And flash forward, sort of cartoonishly something, maybe not evil, but certainly doesn't have a lot of grace extended to him, despite everything he's gone through in his youth. And then there's the cartoonishly good, the Peggotts. Oh my gosh. I mean, even at the end of the book, when Maggot he comes out, he has a boyfriend at the pet store. And then, was it June that says, or Mrs. Peggott says, well, good for him. It felt a little over the top, and perhaps that's okay because I was sort of reading this as if it's in the sort of, again, as someone who's only read Great Expectations 20 times, it did feel to me that those are the kinds of characters you get from Dickens. They are complex and they have some of them have moral ambiguity, but not all of them.
It was interesting what you said about Stoner and Flash Forward because I feel like I know those. I extremely got Flash Forward, which is like this fallen golden boy, right? Like he has this charismatic thing and you can use it for good, which he does initially on Creaky Farm, kind of corralling the boys, even as he's stealing kind of money from them, but then using that money to throw them parties, but those parties are for pills. Like that ping-ponging in my head was complex. But then also those boys who use that same charisma to perpetuate great harm.
Okay, I'll retract my Flash Forward. Maybe he's not as flat as I think he is, but Stoner seems flat.
Yeah, I think though that this is probably a conversation so many readers are having and probably why this book is connecting from people being like, I didn't believe this character, and other people being like, I knew this character.
I completely agree with both of you. I think I gave them a pass because of the Dickensian shadow over the whole book. And I wonder if that's part of the reason that Barbara Kingsolver chose this framework to work in, because it allowed her, I did see a little bit more nuance than what you're describing, but I think that it gave her a passport to creating some types. Not all of the characters were types in my book, but I gave her some leeway because we were working with Dickens.
That actually leads me to my next question, which is the other big component of this book is the mission, the message. Barbara Kingsolver in this book, and then I think in interviews, has been very clear. The purpose of this book, or one of the missions of this book, is to provide a window to a community that is written off by a large portion of the U.S. and the world. She at one point says, people think it's okay to laugh at people in Appalachia. They think it's okay to make fun of them. And do they realize that we can hear them? Part of that is kind of like presenting various types of characters, etc. I'm curious how that mission, that message landed with you and what type of portrait you got of this. I'm going to go to you first, Liz.
That message landed squarely with me. I did not know that much about the history of the region. And I quickly realized I was in the hands of a native, and that not only did I see the impact, the seismic impact of the opioid epidemic, I also saw it within the layers upon layers of histories of unemployment and plants closing and mines closing and mistreatment and being ignored. And I thought that she did such an excellent job of putting it in context. I am not a historian. I don't know the area particularly well. I am from a place called New Jersey that is often the butt of the joke. So I'm always sympathetic to the place that is the butt of the joke. But I thought that what she did with Appalachia really painted a persuasive portrait to me of not just the opioid epidemic, but of the epidemic within a much larger context.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I really appreciated with her thinking about Appalachia and the opioid epidemic is how she was so clear that this is not a community issue. This is a systemic issue. You see that a little bit with not even just the opioids, but with Demon and foster care. It's like all of these institutions that are there to serve aren't doing it because they don't know this community. They don't know what these pills are actually doing, and they're not following up. They don't know who these kids are, how he's failed so many times by his social worker. But then Barbara Kingsolver and Demon says it's not that they didn't care, it's that there were so many kids that they had to deal with too. I feel like her indictment here is so wide-ranging and, again, so clear. I'm going to throw it over to you, Anna. How did you feel about this portrait and this message?
We had spoken earlier about when we feel like the authorial voice is coming in and it doesn't sound like Demon. And generally, I agree, those moments do take you out. But I really liked those parts, which I usually tend not to like.
Tell me more.
There's this part where he's talking about how the economy of the city is money, right? And the reasons that the federal government prefers that economy is because you can tax money. Harder to tax land where you have enough to eat because you grow your food, or you have a community where he says the grandmothers knit quilts for each other and help support. You can't tax that labor as easily. And it was fascinating. It was not something I had really thought about. I, of course, am defensive. I love being a city person, and I could never live anywhere but a city. It was something I had not read in a novel before, and it made me pause and think about how this narrative connects to a larger systemic problem or dynamic.
That's such a good point. And there were moments where she kind of balances that larger kind of commentary with, you just get like a cutting line from a character. I have one open in my book. It's Demon talking to his foster parent's daughter. Her name is Angus. She is one of the great characters of this book. I love her so much. And at one point, she says, "For God's sake, Demon, you're a kid." And he just asks, "Am I, though?" And it's for so much of this book, he's not been treated like a kid by any of the adults in his life or by the systems in his life either. And that was just that perfect merging of the personal and the big picture.
You touched a little on race, but perhaps one theme that felt underdeveloped to me was his relationship to his own race, and even how he could move through the world as someone who is Melungeon. I mean, it comes up occasionally, but it felt like that would be a whole nother very rich, I mean, I suppose the book shouldn't get any longer, but it would be such a rich vein to really sort of examine that felt a little under-examined.
I felt that too, especially again when they were comparing the word hillbilly with the N-word. I was like, there is a racial component here and a racial conversation to be had. It's not happening in this book, for better or for worse. I do think, though, that there seemed to be like this educational imperative in this novel. They didn't feel forced, but it was like, we're going to give you the sample platter. Here's a wide sweep of who we are. Use this and go forth and keep reading and keep researching and continue on, which I kind of appreciate. I feel like if Barbara Kingsolver had crammed all of this into the novel, it would have been a completely different novel. It wouldn't have hit the same. It wouldn't have balanced the same. Yeah, I don't know. I appreciated it.
I agree.
I felt like what it obviously went really deep on was addiction.
Yes.
And if you went into this novel knowing nothing about addiction, you came out of it knowing that for an addict, it's not a clear choice between the drug and a loved one. It's much more complicated than that. And that's kind of what stuck with me. And you're right. I agree. It was a sampler platter. But of the topics that she kind of dug into, that was the one that it really changed my thinking.
How did you approach that storyline and how did it change your thinking?
Maybe it didn't change my thinking, but it was a reminder to me that no matter how much we think we know about addiction, no matter how committed we are to thinking about it as a disease, it's very challenging. I mean, that sounds so basic, but it was just a reminder all over again that it is really tough to beat. One of the sections that I really loved was, can I just read like a few lines that
Of course.
feels like this is Barbara's hand coming in?
Love a quote.
But I really love this. I had roads to travel before I would know it's not that simple, the dope versus the person you love, that a craving can ratchet itself up inside a body and mind at the same time that body's strength for tolerating its favorite drug goes down and down, that the longer you've gone hurting between fixes, the higher the odds that you'll reach too hard for the stars next time. And this paragraph, I won't read the whole thing, but it ends with, you think you're giant, but you are such a small speck in the screwed up world. This is not about you. And I love that line, this is not about you. It applies to both the addict and the person who loves the addict.
I love that too. And one of the things that quote gets at that I really connected with is this book kind of explores when it comes to grappling with addiction, it is very hard to get it right. And this is something that Barbara Kingsolver writes about a lot in this book, which is like, we were following the instructions of doctors. They told us this would be the cure. They said, this is addiction proof. They did all of these things. I was prescribed this and no one knew what was going on and they didn't care afterward. But I was trying to do what I was supposed to do. And similarly, like when Demon is with Dory, his girlfriend, and they start living together and like they're both horribly addicted to a lot of different things. It's like, how do I like support this person and know they need to stop, but if they stop, they're suffering. Like they're walking this like impossible path and it's hard to do right. I'm going to throw it over to you, Anna. Again, this is a big theme of this book is how it kind of grapples with addiction. How did you connect with that storyline and with that theme?
I thought it was incredibly powerful. And to go back to the feeling of not being hungry, to extend that to not being on oxy or not being on a pain medication. It's not the high, for him at least. For Demon, it's not the high, it's the prevention of what it feels like to be in withdrawal. That is what is operating, which she puts into such great relief. You really understand his addiction is not sort of born out of boredom or looking for kicks or fun. It really is born out of just trying not to feel this intense pain and sickness, which was so powerful and so well done.
And heartbreaking here too. That's the thing that I felt a lot while reading this book. I was just like, oh, this person's trying his best and it's still not enough for a variety of reasons way out of his control. And that just breaks my heart. We are going to pivot and talk about how Demon Copperhead is this retelling of David Copperfield. Inspired by that, we wanted to talk about other retellings. What are our favorite reimaginings, retellings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to go over to you first, Liz. What is a favorite retelling of yours?
Well, I went with a lighter one because I thought after Demon Copperhead, people might need a bit of comic relief. So I think I would recommend Eligible by Curtis Sittenfeld. It is a modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice set in the suburbs of Cincinnati. Mr. Bingley's name is Chip. He wears seersucker shorts. The book is kind of funny, but it also has serious undertones. Our colleague Sarah Lyle, in her review of it, wrote, "The characters can be raucous and the situations ungenteel, but not since Clueless, which transported Emma to Beverly Hills, has Austen been so delightfully interpreted."
I love this. Need to read that. And also, Anna and I made eye contact because we were talking about potential retellings and you mentioned.
I said, I wish I could say Clueless. That's my number one pick.
And I was like, we should talk about books, but we're going to find some way to work this in. And you naturally with the assist. So
we
thank
need
you.
Clueless in this.
What about you? In addition to Clueless?
In addition to Clueless, right after Clueless, my recommendation would be Netherland by Joseph O'Neill. It's a book I read when it came out and just stunned me at the time. At the time, it was sort of framed as a great post 9/11 novel. And then now when you sort of look back on it, it does a lot of other things too, including thinking about sort of post-colonialism. It's set in New York. There's a Dutch man who is living with his family right after 9/11. His wife takes their young child and moves back to London. He meets an immigrant, Chuck, from Trinidad, who wants to start a cricket league. And I will say that the retelling here is Gatsby. Chuck is Gatsby in the best possible way, in all of the ways that Gatsby looms large in our imagination. And I'll say that the distinction between Barbara Kingsolver sort of evoking Dickens, Joseph O'Neill has said that Netherland is a saying goodbye to Gatsby and what Gatsby perhaps says about what it means to be American or the hope of the American dream, which is different, right, from what Barbara Kingsolver wants to do, which is really to resurrect Dickens in that approach, which I just thought was fascinating.
I need to check this out, and I wish there were cameras in this room because both Liz and I, when you said it's a saying goodbye, we both cocked our head like I really want to read this. This sounds great.
What's your recommendation for an adaptation?
My recommendation is Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. It is the story of Patroclus and Achilles, and it is wonderful. It is not a lighter one. It is so sad, but it's so beautiful, and that's my sweet spot with literature. I love this. My heart's in 1,000 pieces. I can't wait to tell everybody about it. And then right after that, I read Circe. Loved that for a totally different reason. I think that's all we have time for today. Liz, Anna, thank you so much for joining us. This was so much fun.
Thank you for having me. What an honor.
Same. Thank you, MJ. This was really fun.
Until next time, happy reading.
That was MJ Franklin, Liz Egan, and Anna Dubenko talking about Barbara Kingsolver's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Demon Copperhead. As we mentioned, that was our second book club episode, and in a few weeks we'll have another book club episode, this one about Percival Everett's Erasure, the film adaptation of which, titled American Fiction, was recently nominated for several Oscars. Read the book beforehand if you can, and then listen along to the conversation. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.